Hello, everybody, and welcome to In Pit Lane, the Victory Lap. This is the program we do when we're not doing a program. Yes, while we're locked down and locked out of our studio in at RMI TV Student Television in Grand Prix City, Melbourne, we're stuck in this little box here. And so we took a break from the regular weekly grind of producing a television program on channels 31 and 44. But when you get the opportunity to speak to somebody special, well, then you're going to take that opportunity here on the In Pit Lane YouTube channel. And we're doing that with a very special guest this week, and his name is Pete Lyons. Now, if you don't know Pete Lyons, he is a doyen of international motorsport journalism. Started in the days, the golden era of the Can-Am series in the United States, moved to England, where he became the chief Formula One correspondent and writer for Autosport, which is when I sort of first became aware of his work. He later went on to start a magazine called Formula in the United States. Very, very few people in Australia would know of that magazine, but a brilliant magazine. Really did have a lot to do with the formation and the setting up and the structure of In Pit Lane in terms of the sorts of stories and the things they used to do. So Peter's written several very, very popular and award-winning books. However, his latest tome is dedicated to, well, a marque we really didn't see much of in Australia. In fact, I don't think we ever saw it anywhere at all. I think we saw one Can-Am car came out here at Albert Park for quite a few years ago for that race that they had out there. But apart from that, we never really saw too much of it outside of Formula One, and that is Shadow. And Shadow, a fascinating story and fascinating cars. I've always been interested in Shadow. Aesthetically, they were just really, really pretty cars. And this is a very impressive book. We had at the start of the year, you might remember, it seems an eternity ago now, when we were back in the studio, we had David Dowsey on with his book on Elfin. Well, this is a similar style, a similar standard, quality book that really is an investment. It's not a cheap buy, but if you're really fascinated in the history of a very unique team and a team mired in mystery and intrigue and a whole bunch of things worthy of that name, Shadow, then this is a book that you should really get. But as I said, we had the opportunity of catching up with Pete Lyons very early one morning, or our time, and so let's take you to that interview now. And here's Pete Lyons to talk about his new book on the history of Shadow. First of all, let's talk about the career. How did you get involved in becoming a motorsport journalist?
It goes back to my dad. My dad, Ozzie Lyons, when I was a youngster, I was like 12 years old when Dad was working as a photographer and an engineer with General Electric Company in New York State. But on the weekends, he loved to go to sports car races. And on one of his trips, he fell in with an English guy named Gregor Grant. And it turned out that Gregor Grant was not only a neat guy to talk to, and they got along really well, Gregor had a magazine. And he says, Ozzie, why don't you start sending your photographs to us? And so Ozzie became the U.S. photographer and correspondent. He wrote race stories as well for Autosport magazine. So actually, I grew up in the world.
Now, of course, before I sort of became aware of you in Formula One, you were part of that sort of golden era in reporting the Can-Am series. Now, people in Australia, I mean, particularly our younger viewers, may not understand just how big the Can-Am series was in the late 60s and early 70s. Just give us a bit of a pen picture of just what the Can-Am series was and why it was so significant back in those days.
I have always pointed to the Can-Am with great fondness as the reason I was able to make a living as a journalist, because it came along exactly at the right time that I was ready to do something like this. I was covering races for Autosport. They would be club races in Sebring every year and so on. But when the Can-Am came along in 1966, all of a sudden there was something the Brits really wanted to know about because they had so many of their people running in it. The Bruce McLaren, Denny Hulme, John Surtees, and so on. Surtees was the champion that first year of '66. And when I got to the Can-Am race at Bridgehampton, which was the second round of the series ever in 1966, I was just blown away. I saw my first Chaparral. and that was like a spaceship, right? It just came down from the heaven, from the skies, from the deepest interstellar space, and it was whooshing along the sand dunes of Bridgehampton with its wings flipping up and down. And this was so exciting. These cars were fantastic, and that set the whole tempo and mood of how I reported the stories and what kept me motivated. And I hope I put some of that excitement into what I was writing, because they kept asking me to do it again.
Because as you say, I mean, like the modern equivalent would be people like Max Verstappen and Daniel Ricciardo and Lewis Hamilton going over and running the IMSA North American Sports Car Championship or something. As you said, you had all of the top drivers from Formula One were over there. People like Jackie Stewart and other people you mentioned. As you mentioned the word chaparral there, I mean that was, I suppose, had some influence on what we're talking about today, which is shadow, because the Can-Am series had a very flexible set of regulations which encouraged innovation, and of course Jim Hall in Chaparral was the pioneer of a lot of that, but that later brought on the first shadow cars. So tell us about sort of the evolution of from where Jim Hall was what Jim Hall was doing through to the first shadow.
Well, it was exactly what you just said about the Can-Am. Almost anything was allowed. The basic rule was, that much of a rule. And it said that the cars had to look like sports cars, which meant that they had to cover the wheels and there had to be space for a passenger. It didn't actually say there had to be a seat in there, but people like me, stupid fools like me, could cram in there and go for a ride. And so that endeared those cars to me too. So that was the fact that you could do anything you wanted to. Engines were completely open. You could build any crazy aerodynamic system you wanted. You could have two engines. Jim Hall built a car with two engines. And that was what excited Don Nichols and his buddy Trevor Harris. Trevor was the designer of the first Shadow, the little tiny tire car. And Don Nichols was a very similar fellow. Neither one wanted to be conventional at all. Conventional is uninteresting to them. I mean, what's the point of doing what everybody else is doing and trying to beat them? What's the glory in that? But if we take the risk and build something really radical and wild, and if we are successful, we get the credit for it. Now, that risks falling on your face and doing nothing, which is, sadly, that's what happened. But that was so thrilling to watch that crazy little car, little roller skate. Really, it originally was going to be just a long, slender missile, just hunkered down out of the wind like a go-kart with a sketchy body on it. But by the time they had to make it work, it needed a gigantic wing on the back. And it was no longer as super sleek, but it was still very quick. When in its first race at Mosport in Canada, at the far side of the circuit, there's a very tight right-hand bend at the bottom of a hill. And then the next upwards of a mile, it's a climb. And so the cars, the big 7-liter cars were charging up that hill at a pretty good rate of acceleration. But at the crest of the hill, at the end, the Shadow, George Fulmer driving that crazy little roller skate on, go-kart on steroids, he was going something like 18 miles an hour faster than the McLarens were, which is stunning. So the aerodynamics still worked. Trevor's idea was good, that the lower drag was faster speed. The other side of the equation is then you come to a corner and then you lose everything.
I suppose the inspiration, in many ways, inspired what came later with Ken Tyrrell's 6-wheel Formula One car, with the same sort of philosophy of getting those tyres out of the road, and also later the Delta Wing, which was something that you looked at and went, no, that can't possibly work, but it sort of did.
And let's not forget that Dan Gurney was keen on all that kind of thing too, and he always tried to innovate and do new cars, although his cars were not quite so dramatic as the Shadows were.
And a lot of that innovation actually did spill over into Formula One, didn't it?
It did. The Chaparral Wing, for instance, I continually read British authored stories about how Lotus invented the wing. I'm sorry, fellows, that happened 3 years earlier in America when Jim Hall of Texas invented the wing.
You've also got the with the Can-Am. You mentioned with the Chaparral once again the wings going up and down. The drag reduction system that everybody looks at in Formula One nowadays and thinking, how clever is that? That was 1966 or something like that.
You've touched on a great annoyance for me that when one of the things that they did I think that they started to kill the Can-Am when they imposed a rule banning these movable aerodynamic devices. And so from then on, cars began to look more and more the same. They all had a wing stuck out the back, and the wings got bigger or smaller according to the regulations, but you were still not allowed to do any flipping. When Porsche came in with a sports car, a long coupe that needed some stability, they tried to put little tiny flippers on the back. No, you can't do that. We would rather your car be desperately unstable than safe, because we have a rule. And fast forward, Formula One decides, we need to offer a movable aerodynamic device to redress the issue of the cars not being fast enough on the straight. You idiots!
Well, as you say, the original Shadow was a fairly revolutionary car, but then the subsequent cars were somewhat more conventional. So tell us about the development of the Can-Am cars, because eventually, albeit at the end of the series, they did win a championship, didn't they?
Oh, you've done your homework, I can say. No, you are right. The fact that the tiny tire car had one good feature, but everything else was not good. It didn't have the brakes. It didn't have the suspension. It didn't have the tire grip. It didn't have the stability. It just was not the right answer. Let's point out, though, that people would say, well, why didn't they just run it through the computer and see it wouldn't work? That they didn't have computers. The only computer was to actually build the hardware, take it to the test track, and do the lap times. And that's the only way you could tell whether your idea was going to work or not. So it's a matter of physical evolution in public, which is what made it so exciting. We could go to the race and watch them experimenting. We didn't have to get access to their secret computer room and watch graphs and charts moving on a screen, which would mean nothing to us. We got to smell it and hear it and feel it, feeling that thunder in your chest. That's why it was exciting. But the fact that the first tiny tire car didn't work meant that they had to start evolving more toward conventionality. One of the problems was that the tiny tire car needed tiny tires, and only one company in the world was willing to cooperate to see if they could make them work. That would be Firestone. But when they didn't work, Firestone did everything they could. They gave it full faith effort to make it work. It just was not going to work. And so Firestone pulled out. And so the next time, Don Nichols and his new designer, Peter Bryant, went to Goodyear. Can you build us some tiny tires? No, we're not going to do that. We'll build you one slightly smaller, but we're not going to try that again. And so step by step, the Shadows became taller and more conventional, although you still had lots of unique things about them, as every car did. But eventually a Shadow was like a McLaren, like a Lola, like a titanium car, and so on. They were it was just another one of the standard cars with a fixed wing on the back. Beautiful cars, lovely cars, and as you say, the 1974, Tony Southgate designed the 1974 car, which was called the DN4, and that was a masterpiece. It's still a gorgeous car today.
That was one thing about the Shadows. Of course, a part of Australian motorsport history is Formula 5000, and they moved into Formula 5000, and also obviously eventually Formula One as well. What was the motivation of moving from? I suppose when the Can-Am finished, they decided to move in, or did they make the move beforehand?
No, you are right that when the Can-Am ended at the end of 1974. After only 5 out of 8 planned races, just the public interest just wasn't there, because the cars were a little more boring than they used to be. Shadow was already involved in Formula One. They had started a year earlier in 1973, when Jackie Oliver and George Fulmer drove the Shadows. In 75, their sponsor, UOP, Universal Oil Products, UOP, I've forgotten what it actually means. UOP, that's good enough.
That's good.
They still sponsored people, and they still wanted to sponsor the team. And so the next avenue was to go to Formula 5000. So they literally repurposed a Formula One chassis into a Formula 5000 car with a big engine in the back.
And once again, they were innovative in that way as well. I mean, apart from the Repco Holden engine that we ran here in Australia, I mean, Formula 5000 was totally dominated. It was basically a one make engine series in terms of the Chev. But the Shadow, which is a car, I think it's about the only Formula 5000 marque we've never actually seen down here in Australia. That was powered by Dodge.
It was. Dodge. John Nichols had a deal with Dodge. It involved Matra in his Formula One world too, but because Dodge and Matra were sister companies apparently. But he got Dodge to agree to do an engine program, which means he got the engines for not as much money as he would normally have to pay for a Chevy, which appealed to the man. And they did have this converted NASCAR V8, which was larger physically, bulkier and heavier, but it had to be de-stroked down to the 5-liter limit. And it was a really fast motor. It was a stout motor, but it was also heavy, and the center of gravity was quite high. Still in all, the car was competitive, and Jackie Oliver won. He didn't win races, but he was very competitive, and on points, he might well have won that first series in 1975. And he did come back in 1976, and out of the, I guess, 8 or 9 races, he did win a race legitimately fair and square. And so they did well with that hybrid Formula One car with a, Trans Am engine stuck in the back.
You mentioned Jackie Oliver's name a number of times. I mean, he became very, very important in the history of Shadow, and I suppose in a way was also very much part of its demise many years later. Tell us about how that relationship started and how Jackie came from being just a driver to having more of an influence in the running of the company.
It would be good if you get Jackie on the air too, but he's a lovely bloke to talk to. You'll enjoy it. The Jackie Oliver came to Shadow because he had already been involved with Peter Bryant. In 1969, a British mechanic, Peter Bryant, who had come to America and was doing quite well in Can-Am and also IndyCar racing and other things. He did some sports cars. I think he came over to America first with John Surtees in a Ferrari when Surtees was driving a Ferrari in America back in the early 60s. But Peter stayed on, and in 1969, he decided he would build his own Can-Am car, because how hard could it be, right? But he's an ambitious, inventive, ingenious fellow. And he said to himself, he's going to need a driver. So what drivers would he like? So he actually literally rang up Jackie Oliver in England and sold him on the idea that he should come to America and drive his TI-22, which was the titanium car in 1969 and 70. So that got Jackie interested in staying in America. And then when Peter Bryant lost his titanium car deal, he then approached Don Nichols and said, Don, you and I should get together. We both competed last year. We fell on our faces. Let's get together and win the series this time with a new Shadow. And so Jackie Oliver was already on board with Peter Bryant, so that's how he got plugged in. And furthermore, I think I'm sure in 1973, when Shadow went to Formula One, they got UOP interested in a worldwide presence as well. So UOP gave them the budget. Jackie Oliver is the guy who convinced Don Nichols that if you're going to really make an international splash, Formula One is where you've got to be. And Don thought that sounded like fun. Let's go dominate Formula One like we just, like we're trying to dominate Can-Am. Don would hardly ever say no to any opportunity like that. And so Jackie became an integral part of the team. And as he eased out of race driving, he took on more of a management role, particularly in the sponsor hunting, because when they lost UOP at the end of 75, they were desperately short of money. So Jackie shouldered the load of going out and talking to all these other potential sponsors and doing the deals.
One of the things, as I said, there is once again an Australian connection with Shadow, because they only ever won the one Formula One race, and that was with our own Alan Jones behind the wheel. So tell us about that. Tell us about the Formula One victory, and also AJ becoming a part of that team.
Yes, indeed. AJ was very, very gracious in letting me chat with him for quite a while about that. He was another driver who had not made it per se. He was never in good equipment, and he was a bit at a loss for what to do next when, unfortunately, Shadow suffered a tragedy. Tom Pryce was killed due to a stupid accident in South Africa. So all of a sudden, Shadow needed another driver, and there was Alan Jones. And so they plugged Alan Jones into the car in 1977, was it? 70. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the year. I'll have to look at my book. They didn't do terribly well until they got to Austria, and they had a new model of the car, the DN8C, which had much refined aerodynamics and a few other things. So it was quite quick. And it was a day with odd weather conditions and a lot of trouble striking other people, whereas Alan Jones kept this car on the road at very competitive speeds. And lo and behold, at the end of the race, he was out front, and whoop-de-doo, he won the Austrian Grand Prix. And he's agreed with me. The reports at the time all show this completely gobsmacked Aussie going, I can't believe it. I can't believe what I've just won.
Well, it was very much part of his development, because I mean, it would obviously put him out there and showed that he could win a race. So and that would lead obviously to getting the offer from Williams and moving on to a world championship. So once again, Shadow had a very keen involvement with that. You mentioned the split. A lot of people they might not be familiar in Australia with Shadow as much as they are with what came after Shadow, which was Arrows. Tell us how that all happened. It was a pretty messy sort of divorce, wasn't it?
Well, it honestly, it was all financial. Don Nichols was losing sponsors left and right because, let's face it, the man was not someone you really. The word was, if you do a business deal with Don, be very, very careful. And people don't like to deal with that. Word gets out. He doesn't pay bills. He doesn't share money with people. When money does come in, it's siphoned out very parsimoniously. He's not a pleasant guy to work with. He had lots of good qualities. I'm not saying that he didn't, but he was very possessive of his company. And Jackie Oliver actually, I believe that Jackie actually asked him, said, look, Don, I'd like to be a part of your company. I'd like to be a shareholder. Give me like 15%, and that will give me the ability to go out and do more and give me a long-term situation so that I can really focus on it. And Don just would not do that. And finally, the situation got to the point where they didn't have any money. Things were sitting in a shop undone. There was a new car ready to be built for the following year. They couldn't build it. And Jackie says, right, I've had enough. I'm walking out. Who's with me? And almost everybody in the shop said, yes, you're right. There's no future here. We're going to Arrows.
Yes, it was a sad end to the history of Shadow. For people who buy and read the book and have a look at the magnificent photos you've got in there, what would you like them to take away from reading the book in terms of recognising the history of Shadow and its contribution to international motorsport?
I would say that there's a lot of answers to that, but what bubbles up to the top of my mind is it's a human story, a personal story. And it really is all about Don Nichols, the very mysterious, taciturn, shadowy character who had a mysterious background and never really revealed anything about himself. And his ability to pull all of the necessary things together to make a pretty darn good effort. in Can-Am and in Formula One, and even decent job in Formula 5000, with desperately underfunded in most cases. And the funding was, I don't think, very well managed based on what I've been told. And he had some personality quirks that meant that he would be handicapped, whereas a Dan Gurney, a Roger Penske, a Jim Hall, they were much more open, friendly people. People would be introduced to them and they'd talk about projects, and the person would be excited, and you'd like to do a deal with them. You talked with Don Nichols, and I talked with him quite often at the racetracks. I always felt this sense of um, aloofness from him. He was not, to the outside world, he was not a warm, engaging, smiley kind of a guy. So I think that hurt him. I've noticed a lot of people who are successful are also very outgoing and friendly. You like to be in their company.
Earlier in the year, we had a guest on the program, Dave Dowsey, who was written a very impressive tome on the history of Elfin, the Australian marque. Absolutely, a similar style of book. I mean, people say print media is dead, but the beauty of a book like the Elfin book and the book that you have written here is very much that they are heirlooms. They are things. I've got books in my collection, not motor racing, but that go back to the 1800s, and that's something we're not going to see in the future. This is very much an investment, isn't it?
This is Evro Publishing in the UK did such a beautiful job with this. This sucker is massive, right? This thing is 464 pages. It's got over 600 photographs in it, and I think it weighs something like 2 kilos. It's a massive piece, and it's absolutely gorgeous. The work they've done in this book is fantastic. I could open it up, but it'd fall out of my poor hands.
Well, it is available from purchasers. Booktopia here in Australia will have copies available very soon. I will put a link to where that people can get the book.
If I may put a plug, they could also get it with my autograph if they go to my website.
Well, I think that's even better then.
Yeah, well, it's PeteLyons.com, all lowercase PeteLyons.com. Now, I will say that although we do already have several Aussie buyers, because they buy my annual calendar a lot, so a lot of them is fronted up for the book. It's expensive to get there. In US dollars, it's a $100 book, and it's not far short of that to ship it to Australia. I'm sorry about that, but a few people have sucked it up and done it, which is very gratifying.
We unfortunately are used to the penalty payment of being so far from everywhere else.
That's an advantage in some cases, I think.
Particularly now. Although having said that, the reason we're doing this interview from my spare room at home and not in our regular big television studio is obviously because we're all still locked down here at the moment. So,
well, may I say I've only been to Australia once. I had a flying visit to the Indy at Brisbane once at Surfers Paradise, but I wanted to go on and see the rest of the country. It sounds like I'm sorry, I'm sucking up to you, but honestly, you guys are so excited and enthusiastic and friendly, and you've got such a magnificent country. I sort of envy your location in the world, because I won't say it's a paradise, but maybe you think it is, but it's such a fascinating, vibrant place, and we have had so many great racing people come from there.
Well, we would certainly love you to come down for something like the Phillip Island Historic Classic. That's our biggest, and it just happens to usually occur the week before something called the Australian Grand Prix at Albert Park. But you don't need to bother about that if you don't want to. But the Phillip Island Historic Classic is a wonderful event, and you'd be very, very welcome down there. I'm sure the Victorian Historic Racing Register would love to have you on board. So hopefully, when we get over this nonsense that we're all going through right now, we can get back to some sense of normality, and you'll get an opportunity to come down and be a part of it. But Pete, thank you for joining us today. It will be really good to have a look at that. Shadows, as I said, I think because of the fact that we never have really seen a shadow, at least for the Formula 5000 or the Can-Am car down here, it really has always been a fascinating marque to me, and also, as you say, they were just aesthetically so pleasing. They're still a very, even the rebodied Formula 5000 single seat Can-Am car was attractive, and you couldn't say that about a lot of those cars.
That's right. That's true. Yes. Don Nichols did have an artistic eye. The man had a love of beautiful things and good styling. He was not a technical man. He didn't know anything about how the thing worked or how to make it better. So, but he wisely stayed away from that. He didn't tell people what to do, for the most part. But he did have the wisdom to bring in the best possible people he could get.
Well, in the modern era, of course, where cars are produced out of computers and all look the same, and aesthetics is really not a big thing anymore. It is wonderful to be able to look back at those cars from the Can-Am and from the golden days of sports car racing in the 60s and 70s, and look at just how beautiful those cars were. Pete, once again, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. I hope people will go out and buy the book, the Shadow book. What's the next project?
Well, I already did a Lotus book for Evro, and they've asked me what's the next one. I've got some other ideas too, but tackling one of these things is a big job for a guy my age, and I'm going to have to think twice about it before I say, okay, here's another year of my life for this, because it's hard work and rewarding work, but I want it to be a good book.
Well, once again, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. And everybody watching, go out and buy the book if you're a real lover of classic motor racing and classic cars, and a really fascinating, as you say, personal story. Go out and check out Pete's new book. Pete Lyons, thanks for joining us in Pit Lane.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you to Pete Lyons for that chat. That was fascinating. I mean, this is a man who's forgotten more about motor racing than I'll ever know. It was great to catch up with him and talk about a marque that, as I said, has always really fascinated me. And if you go through and have a look at the online at some of those photos, some of the photos from of the Shadows and the various marques, you will realise just what an aesthetically beautiful car that they were. As I said, even that Can-Am car, the single-seat car, when they had the revival, was a very attractive little car. So thanks for joining us on In Pit Lane. Remember, if you would like to keep in touch, we are on Facebook. And remember, every Thursday night, Australian time, Melbourne time, at 9 o'clock, we have what we call In Pit Lane Full Course Yellow. And that's just basically a Zoom chat that we stream live to Facebook, where myself and Doc and Peter and other people, including you, can become involved. We just get together for about an hour and talk about the week in motorsport. So if you'd like to become a part of that, make sure you go to our Facebook page, like the page, and there's a link in there. You can go onto our and fill out a form and get an invite to be on the panel. So instead of just sitting there and watching it, you can actually join the conversation, and we'd love you to do that. It's something that we're sort of working on at the moment, and we're having a lot of fun every Thursday night while we're under the current situation. So thank you for watching. Now there is a link down down in the comments here on Facebook about how you can get Pete's book. As he said, if you want an autographed copy, and I think it does add considerably to the expense in terms of postage, but I really think it would be worth it, to be honest with you, to that extra $100 or so just to have a personalised copy from Pete Lyons would be something very special. So yeah, by all means, go into the link below, and we'll give you a couple of options to get that book. But it's certainly worth it. So until we sort of catch up with you again for another edition of In Pit Lane, the Victory Lap, thank you for joining us. And from myself and all the team here at In Pit Lane, thanks for joining us, and bye for now.